Okay, well, good morning. It's really nice to meet you, Johan. I'd really like to say thank you for giving your time to our podcast, Inclusion Dialogue. And I'm really interested in having this chat with you and maybe hearing a little bit about the Swedish context. But would you mind if I started our chat asking you how you ended up working in the area of inclusive education?
Okay, thank you for inviting me for this video interview. Yeah, my background is that my parents were teachers, first of all, both of them. So I grew up in a family where we often talked about school and about students, and I followed my father, who was a kind of special teacher, to his work at some occasions and so forth. Both my brother and my sister both became teachers, as well as they married teachers, and I married a teacher as well. So that's the short story. And I worked as a teacher for about 10 years. The first 2 years with students that were in UK terms described as mentally challenged. That kind of schools for students with intellectual impairments. And I worked for about 2 years in these school settings. And then I worked in regular or mainstream schools for about 8 years. So I was very interested in special pedagogy, and I was starting my PhD studies 94 in the autumn, and I started to work in a project about students with biological causes for their movement disabilities. They had, for example, cerebral palsy or spina bifida or these kinds of diagnoses that with a clear cause that are clearly related to biological causes. But we also had some groups where it was some kind of difficulties in their central nervous system. For example, in the what do you say, spinal cord. Yeah. So we have that as a second group, and a third group where they had motor disabilities without any kind of connection to the central nervous system. So we actually looked at 3 different kinds of student groups, and we had a very close collaboration in our team when we had medical professions, neurologists and also psychologists. And so it was many disciplines involved in this research. And what I looked at was, how do these schools work with these students, and are they focusing on their causes for their difficulties in schools when they had them? Because when you look at the average results, they were quite low, actually. So we started to manipulate with different things, and I went out to schools. And first of all, we tried to figure out, okay, what's the situation like for this group of students in Sweden? This was 95, and we found out that when we identified all the students that should be part of this academic achievement tests, they were not there. Most of them were not part of the tests because the teacher said, well, we don't want them to feel unhappy in this situation. We're worried about their health and so forth. So we couldn't get much results in that study. The results we got, however, some of the students wrote that, I really don't like these time restrictions. And I could also see that the students that actually took part in these tests, they usually only could manage the first of the items that they worked with. Some of them, however, only chose to work with the last ones, but they didn't manage so many. So the test results were quite low. So in the second study, we did a kind of, we changed we had the same kind of test procedures, but we changed the test time limits. Do you follow me so far?
Yes, I really do.
So we said to the teachers, when your student has worked for 20 minutes or 50 minutes, depending on what kind of test it was and how long time, just put a mark how far they have got, and then let them proceed.
Mm-hmm.
And their test results were above the average for the nation.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was a huge discrepancy between the time limits that they were offered and when they were offered more time to complete their tests.
Yeah.
So I think that was very interesting. And when I went out into schools, I found that these students were very often in a segregated setting, sitting with a student assistant. We call them that in Sweden.
Yeah.
You would probably call them teacher assistant in the UK or in Ireland.
In Ireland,
sorry.
It's special needs assistant here. Yeah.
Yeah, special needs assistant. Yeah. And they didn't get a proper education. So many of them were, I would say, segregated within the school. Yeah. And when you look at the medical research about these students, because when they come to the clinics, they often have them enrolled in some kind of research studies, where they also want to check out what's their achievements in school. And they use some kind of tests, and they use the time limits, and they find that, well, there are these results are quite low for these student groups, and they look at different kinds of diagnoses and so forth.
Yeah.
But I would say when they claim different kinds of biological causes, they are not aware about their school situation. They take for granted that they had the same kind of education that their peers. Yeah. That's not the case.
Yeah. Can I ask you, in terms of just our listeners, to get the context in which a study like that taking place, can you give us a crash course in the Swedish education system? Would it focus on special education over time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think many of your listeners have the impression that Sweden has a school system that is equitable, with high standards and high achievements in national tests and so forth. I would say it used to be like that. But in the 90s, we had several huge reforms in Sweden about our school system, where it was decided that the decision-making should be more decentralized. So the 290 municipalities, they should guarantee a good education for all. But some of these municipalities with about 2,000 or 3,000 inhabitants, I don't think they have the qualities or the knowledge to have this kind of responsibility. So we used to have some kind of centralized school system previously, and now it came down to the municipalities and even down to each principal at the local school to make the decisions based on a school system that is steered by the government by goals. You have the goals, you have the curriculum, and you also have the teacher training, education. And that's what the government has their tools, so to speak, to govern, to administer the school system. And we also in the 90s started with the free school movement, if you are aware of that. That means that we have independent schools that are financed by taxes, like all schools, but they can also have economic benefits from the schools. So they're only interested in getting money out from these schools, so that they are not investing them. So then you can ask yourself, how is that possible? Well, is it actually an idea to get money out from tax-funded schools? And I would say yes. And it works like this, that if you can concentrate and you can have the best students to come to your school, and they won't need so much of resources, then you can have a lower teacher-student ratio. You don't have to have so many psychologists and social workers in schools and so forth. But you still get the same kind of money. Okay, then you get more money than you actually need. And that's the profit that you can gain from these schools.
So is it socially stratified then? Is it
yeah.
Okay.
It is, in fact. It should not be. And they are trying to have some kind of restrictions about this from the government. But I would say it's not easy to do that. I have been doing research in these kind of schools and who they choose to come and who they choose that they don't want to enroll in the schools. It's very tricky to find out for the government, for example, when they are meeting parents to children and they are informing about their schools and they want the students to come to the school. When a student comes to these people who owns the schools and says, well, my student have some kind of difficulties. Is this the right kind of school? It looks very promising. And they can get the message, well, we don't focus on these kinds of students. So we think it's better that you choose another school where they have resources for this. But we also have a kind of schools that specialize in students with, for example, ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or something else. And the municipalities, I think they regard this as a kind of solution, so they don't need to change the school environments and make these schools more inclusive, because there is someone else that is expert on these children. And we gladly pay for this, even if they have to pay a lot of money for this, because it's all about profits for these companies as well, or for many of these schools as well.
And does that mean does that mean that the other schools become a far more mixed group of students with more challenging kind of needs, if you like? Does it mean you have a homogenous school system in these free schools, and then the remainder of the school system has the more diverse student groups?
We have more diverse school system, if you talk about the different kinds of schools today, than we used to have. Previously, we worked along the principle of you should go to the nearest school, nearest school principle. That's the United nations have said, well, that could be a good idea. You should not have to go to sitting in a taxi or in a bus or have your parents to drive you to a kind of special school somewhere else, for example. The nearest school should provide you with good education, and then you should build up the capacity in the nearest school in your vicinity, or in your home environment, so to speak. But that's not the case today. So you get a bus ticket, and you can choose which school you want to go to. So it's a kind of parent choice, and some parents are very good at deciding what kind of school would suit my child for the future. And other parents, they are not aware of this.
Yes,
they don't have the knowledge about the school system, and they have difficulties to speak for their children, I would say, to take the best route within the school system, the best road, so to speak.
And since describe the 1990s as being a big turning point, and there have been a lot of change since then. Ask the relationship between maybe central government and policymakers and people like yourself in the academic space who are offering opinions and voices on these tensions in the system.
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow you quite as you would like me to, but
well, I can say it again if you like. It's basically does academia have input into the policy making decisions around education?
Yes, to some extent, but not the full extent that we are building a kind of developing a kind of school based on research or research evidence. But the decision about what kind of research is not neutral. It's favoring some kind of perspectives, because this is very much about party politics, I would say, at least in Sweden. So, for example, it's a huge debate about order in schools, the social order in schools, about behavioral issues in schools. And that's the kind of research that I have been focusing on the last years, as I found it to be the most problematic part for the schools. There are huge numbers of children that are not behaving according to the norms in the schools, or at least some reports says this, and some political parties have this as their main argument to change the school, I would say. I don't think it's that bad. I think it's similar to many other nations or countries that are facing the same kind of problems. But it has absolutely been a more intense debate, and there have been a more medicalized debate, or what you would say, where we say that it's very much about individual difficulties. It's an individual deficit perspective that has gained dominance in the debate, and where the use of medical diagnosis, especially developmental neuropsychiatric diagnosis, have gained the dominance of how we look at children behavior today. And it has gone so far. So when I tried to, I was invited by the authority that supports the special education in schools. We have a division between the main authority for all schools, and we have one authority for special education in these schools and in special schools. So I was invited to write about ADHD from a pedagogical perspective.
Yeah.
Because I was one of few that have done this in Sweden. And we had a synopsis and an agreement about what I should write about based from a pedagogical perspective. And my message was that we should be aware of that there's no biological indicator, or we can't find a biological mark for when it's some kind of biological condition behind, or when it's about, for example, socioeconomic situation and other kinds of difficulties in the home family or whatever, divorces, or that have some kind of impact on the behavior.
Is there any research in your field on the role of the school context, the school climate in impacting on the behavior of students, whether they have ADHD or other types of disabilities?
Yes, I would say we have not that much of research, but we have several research studies looking at, but I don't think we have in any way tried to figure out and look at the causes for the behavior and I would say that when you look at the neuropsychiatric research, they are making claims that they don't have evidence for that. And when it comes to the causal relationship between how the brain functions and the behavior, or the causes for why the brain functions in a certain way. But because, of course, your behavior is related to how your brain works. That's the case for all people. Obviously, we can't deny that. But when you say there's some kind of that there are biological causes that makes you work, makes you function in an atypical way, or a way that is deviant, I would say, from that is not normal, that is abnormal. When you claim this, I would say that the research in this area from the neuropsychiatric paradigm makes too long claims for how many of these students that have a diagnosis that actually have a biological cause or a genetic cause. There are a small portion of them where there is a claim. That I can agree about. But when you're talking about 10% of the population, and that's because of a biological cause in your brain that is abnormal.
So you think it's an overstatement?
It's obviously an overstatement. It's and I think we are having the highest prevalence. I'm not sure about this, but we have a very high prevalence, and we are following in the steps of the US. And, you know, in the US, in some of the states, you have a prevalence where every third male has an ADHD diagnosis. So how do you use the criteria? And when you look at the true prevalence studies, you don't find that there has been a change in behavior for 10 or some claim even 30 years. But we have a school system where we don't have enough with provision for the students. So when students have some kind of difficulties, we now have a view that it must be biological, because we have so much of influence from the biological perspective, from proponents of the biological perspective, I would say. So when I come out to school, they actually say, even about the students that don't have a diagnosis, they say, well, I recognize this. It's obviously ADHD. Yeah. So there's a kind of pseudo-diagnosing in the schools as well. So we're looking at individual deficits when we have so many other things to improve in the school context. When it comes to teaching, for example, also when it comes to, we have another kind of difficulty or problem in Sweden, that is, young people, they're not interested to become teachers. So it has got a low status, and it's hard work in schools. Many young people, even if they have went into teacher training studies, they quit quite early in their career.
Can I ask, Johan, do you think, given what Sweden has kind of gone through over the past 2-3 decades, and is inclusion on the agenda anymore, or is it committed now to a special education sector?
It's a drive towards, or a very strong trend encouraged by the government, that we should have more special education classes, more segregating measures, more of pupil-referred units, for example. And it has been stated that inclusion has gone too far.
Okay.
But I would say that we have never seen inclusion. It's kind of an idea. And when I talk about inclusion and inclusive education, I usually think about inclusion as the end of or the goal of something that is in a continuum. But if you go to that point and you go to the opposite point, that is full exclusion, where students are not allowed to go to school. And all the way here, it's a continuum from full exclusion to full inclusion. And we're going to full exclusion on that direction. But we're not there. We're somewhere in the middle, I would say. Yeah.
Is there anything, I'm not going to keep you much longer, Johan, but is there anything that you'd like the listeners to hear that maybe we haven't touched on today? Is there anything else you'd like to add to this conversation that I haven't raised yet?
It's hard to say.
Take your pick.
Yeah, you can pick and choose, but the main thing, and what we are concentrating on, is to get the voices from the children to a larger degree than we have done before, because we have found that, we are very often very good intentions. We want to provide students with a good situation. A good learning situation where they have friends and there's a friendly atmosphere in the classrooms, and no bullying, and a good progress academically, and so forth. When it comes to students in needs of special support, we too seldom ask them how they would like to have it. And we don't have so much research about this either. So we're concentrating on getting student voices to a much higher degree now. For example, it has been found that students that had, for example, ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, and when they were part of research when we were looking back at their schooling. They were young adults. In interviews, they said, well, we didn't get any help in schools. And the researchers looked at this and said, well, they have had plenty of resources. Many measures have been done. But that was from a professional perspective. And the students didn't, or the young adults didn't find this as a help for them.
That's interesting.
So just putting them in a segregated measure, for example, a special unit, some kind of special class, is not automatically, just because you provide a lot of resources, a higher teacher-student ratio, it doesn't mean that the student feel that they are helped in that environment. Because we need to look more at what kind of things are we actually doing, not just putting more resources into something, because that's a waste of resources at the same time. So we are now trying to figure out with what I call a segregation staircase. We're looking at student experiences in different kinds of segregated settings, from being segregated within the classroom to being segregated in the school, to being separated from the school to another kind of, and try to look at what are the experiences. And some of the students have been increasingly being moved out into a more distant education system. And I think every separation that I've gone through has in some way been done some kind of impact on their identity as students, because they don't fit anywhere. And we're also looking at the other side in action research and trying to figure out what works when we try to get them back into regular schools or mainstream schooling. So that's what we are trying to do right now in a research group. And this is in collaboration with Professor Michael Shevlin at Dublin University. And Professor Richard Rose at Northampton, and a group of colleagues, Kristina Hellberg, Gunve Mellås in Sweden, and three doctoral students.
Excellent. Can I ask, before I let you go, is there anywhere listeners can find out a little bit more about your research, or any publications you'd like to highlight today?
I would first of all like to say that it would be worth looking at one retroductive study that I have done. And now you ask, what is a retroductive study? Well, in short, I did like this. I wanted to see to what extent that schools with a same kind of socioeconomic situation in their catchment area, and they have the same kind of resources, and being within the same kind of policy in the same municipality. I wanted to see if I could find differences in how the schools worked with students in the area of emotional and behavioral difficulties, or if they have ADHD or anything like that. And I started to look at, as they were in the same municipality, first of all, I looked at all statistics about how many students that have been referred to a pupil referral unit for 10 years. And it was a huge difference between different kinds of schools, obviously. In socioeconomically poor areas, they had many students come, much higher. And in the affluent areas, almost no students at all coming to the PRUs. But I wanted to see if they have the same conditions, that the schools are very, very similar. And if you can find schools that have different rates of exclusion, refers to the pupil referral units. And I found one school that had only one for 10 years.
Wow.
And I find 2 schools that had at least one every year. So it's a tenfold difference. Yeah. And when I looked at how the schools worked in a case study research approach, they worked completely different. For example, in the 2 schools where they had pupil referral units, they had some kind of special classes. They worked towards inclusion in the school that did not have referrals.
Okay.
Or they had only one referral during these 10 years. They, in that school, that I call the school A, that did not have referrals, they worked proactively. They started with children in the preschool, following up everyone individually. And as soon as they got some kind of indicators indicating that something was not good, they started to do something. Okay. So I would say, and the way that they gave a mandate for a responsibility for the special education needs coordinators, that in Sweden, they need to have teacher training first, and then they have 2 years on advanced level. So it's not the same type of Senkos as in the UK. I don't know how it is in Ireland. But when they got a mandate to work towards inclusion, I think that was one of the most important things, because in the other cases, in the other 2 schools, they don't have any mandate. Do call it mandate? To work. They weren't even allowed into some of the classes. The teacher said, "I don't want to collaborate with you." And the Senkos, they said, we could do so much if we had a principal that supported us. But as in both these schools, it was a situation where where the principals left after 2 years, 3 years, all the time.
Turnover.
But we had the same principal in school A for more than these 10 years. And this principal had a mantra that this school is for all. So we need to make things work for everyone. So if it's it's the hen and chicken dilemma, which comes first. I think the principal came to school where she could succeed, and she wanted to work there because she found that they are thinking in the same direction as I am doing. So I think the combination here worked very well. And I would like to see more of these kind of studies, because this kind of data you have, I would say, in most countries. Why aren't we trying to figure out backwards, why is the situation like it is right now by using this retroductive approach?
Okay, well, listen, thank you for going over that, and I think listeners will be really interested. I really enjoyed chatting with you today, Johan. I think I've learned enough.
Thank you.
In the last 45 minutes, so really appreciate your input, and take care.
Okay, thank you very much.